"You're amazing, Yi-Chuan, but I can't. I'll end up in the emergency room." The crystal decanter shattered against the mahogany dresser, expensive cognac weeping down the hand-carved wood as shards exploded across the penthouse suite. My guards stood like statues outside the heavy double doors, listening as yet another woman scrambled for her clothes, her breath hitching in a panic that had nothing to do with my reputation as the head of the Soul Syndicate. "I'm sorry," she gasped, nearly tripping over her designer heels as she fumbled for the handle. It's too much. I could actually get hurt." The door slammed with a finality that echoed through the silence. I poured myself another drink, my hand trembling, not with the cold calculation of the chairman, but with a raw, jagged humiliation. That was the 7th woman in 3 months. 7 high society beauties, 7 models, 7 identical exits that all whispered the same word into the sterile air. Freak. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Victor, my right hand, was calling about the Melanov shipment down at the Incheon docks. I threw the device across the room, watching it skitter across the marble. For once, the organization could bleed without me. I drained the glass, my mind spiraling back to when I actually allowed myself to have hope. The memory hit me like a physical blow. 3 days ago, I'd been in the back office of the Crimson Lotus, buried in ledgers, when Victor walked in with that shark-like grin. "Chairman, you have to see the new girl at the club," he'd said, dropping into the leather chair opposite me. "Not interested," I'd muttered, never looking up. "Come on, Yi-Chuan. When was the last time you even tried?" 2 weeks ago, same result." Victor went quiet then. He was one of the few who knew about the curse that made me look like a god in a tailored suit, but left me more isolated than the men I buried. He spent the next hour insisting we hit the Lower East Side, just for a drink. Finally, just to silence him, I agreed. That night, I walked into the pulsing red lights of the club, wearing a suit that cost more than a waitress makes in a year. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of Wall Street desperation. I sat in the VIP section, nursing a whiskey and ignoring the hollow ache in my chest. I had built an empire by 30, but I couldn't keep a woman for an hour once the lights went down. Then the spotlight shifted. The woman who walked out, Nya Monroe, made the air leave my lungs. She moved with a confidence that didn't apologize for existing, her dark, coiled hair catching the light as she scanned the room with eyes that had clearly survived a lifetime of storms. "That's her," Victor whispered. "She's been here 2 months. Every guy in this room wants a piece, but she doesn't give anyone the time of day." I watched her, and for the first time in years, something shifted. It wasn't just the sight of her, it was the recognition. She had the look of someone who wasn't afraid of the dark, and for a man like me, that was the most dangerous hope of all. The pulsing bass of the Crimson Lotus vibrated through the floorboards, a relentless heartbeat that matched the agitation in my chest. I sat in the shadows of the VIP section, my tailored black suit a stark contrast to the neon chaos below. Victor sat beside me, nursing a drink and watching the crowd with a predator's ease, while I tried to ignore the hollow, familiar ache of being the most powerful man in a room full of people I couldn't truly touch. "You're doing it again, boss," Victor murmured over the rim of his glass. "Looking like you're at a funeral instead of the hottest club in the city." I didn't answer. I was watching the waitresses move through the smoke, ghosts in white and dark fabric, invisible to the men who thought they owned the world. Then I saw her. Nya Monroe didn't walk through the crowd. She navigated it like a captain in a storm, her long, natural curls cascading over her shoulders and her wide, expressive eyes scanning the tables with a look of calm, calculated survival. When she reached our table, she didn't flinch at the sight of my neck tattoos or the way the other servers hovered at a distance. "Whiskey for the chairman, and whatever he's having," she said, her voice warm but tinged with a sharp, professional edge as she set the glasses down without a tremor in her hand. "You know who I am?" I asked, my voice low. "Everyone knows who you are, Chairman Kang," she replied, meeting my gaze with a shocking level of indifference. "But that doesn't make the ice melt any slower. Drink up before it gets watered down." She turned to leave before I could even find a retort, her simple white top and dark shorts making her look more real than any designer-clad woman I had ever brought to my penthouse. I found myself standing before I realized what I was doing, ignoring Victor's surprised call as I followed her toward the bar. "Wait," I called out, reaching her as she signaled the bartender for a water. I'm not finished. Nya turned slowly, sizing me up with eyes that seemed to read every crack in my armor. I don't do private dances, and I don't give out my number just because a man wears a suit that costs more than my tuition, she said, her lips parted slightly in an expression that was part curiosity and part challenge. I don't want to dance, I said, feeling a reckless hope spark for the first time in years. I want 5 minutes of conversation, somewhere quiet. She studied me for a long beat, her mind clearly weighing the risk against the reward. Finally, she gestured toward a corner booth, her old, weary eyes searching mine for a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to give. 5 minutes, Chairman, clock's ticking. The following evening, I stood outside the gleaming glass entrance of a restaurant that usually required a 6-month wait, checking my watch with a hand that refused to stay steady. When the yellow cab finally pulled to the curb and Nya stepped out, the breath left my lungs. She wore a simple black dress that made her look more elegant than any of the designer-clad women I usually dated, though I noticed her fingers gripping her purse with a telltale tightness. Inside, the atmosphere was one of stifling, high-end luxury, but Nya navigated it with the same quiet strength she used to handle the rowdy crowds at the club. We sat at a private corner table overlooking the city, the light catching the natural coils of her hair. She ordered water, matter-of-factly mentioning her mother's decline as the reason she avoided family traditions involving a bottle. So, Chairman, she said, leaning forward with eyes that missed nothing, what's your damage? Why can't the most eligible bachelor in the city keep a girlfriend for more than a month? The question hit me like a physical blow. I took a deep breath, realizing this was the moment where everything would either fall apart or impossibly come together. I have a complication, I finally admitted, shifting uncomfortably in my expensive suit. A physical thing. 7 women have walked out on me in the last 3 months because of it. I'm tired of being a freak, Nya. I waited for the flinch, the panic, or the sudden excuse to leave. Instead, Nya didn't move. She didn't look away. How complicated are we talking? She asked, her voice dropping into a professional, clinical tone. I'm a nursing student, Yi Chuan. I've seen every body type imaginable in the clinics. If you think I'm going to run because of biology, you don't know me at all. I looked at her, stunned into a heavy silence. I had spent years hiding in a fortress of power to mask an insecurity that made me feel subhuman, yet this woman was treating my deepest shame like a clinical problem to be solved. I'm too big, I whispered, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. Every woman I've been with says it's too much, that I'll hurt them. They panic and they leave. Nya reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine for just a second, a spark of recognition passing between us. Listen to me, she said, her gaze burning with a truth that needed no further proof. We'll figure it out together, like adults who communicate and don't panic at the first sign of difficulty. I looked down at our joined hands, marveling at the absurdity and the grace of it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being looked at as a monster or a conqueror, but as a man who finally had a chance to not be alone. The following 2 days were a blurred chaos of meetings, threats, and tense negotiations. The fragile peace I had found in Nya's presence was shattered when Victor burst into my office with a grim look that signaled a war I hadn't authorized. Melanov's nephew had been found dead in the Hudson, and the Russian family was already screaming for blood, convinced the Seoul syndicate had ordered the hit. My blood went cold, not out of fear for my organization, but because I finally had something real to lose. Trust was shattered across the city, and every captain was on edge as the Melanov family prepared for a devastating move. I had to prove my innocence while simultaneously investigating which of my own men had been stupid enough to play games behind my back. It turned out to be a hothead named Polly, who had been skimming from our gambling operations and panicked when the Russians started asking questions. I had him delivered to Melanov's people in a trunk, a clear message that I handled my own problems and did not tolerate disloyalty, but the damage was irreversible. Through the spiraling violence, Nya remained my only anchor. She sent little messages that made me smile despite the blood on the horizon, photos of her cat, complaints about her pharmacology professor, and stupid memes that always landed at exactly the right moment. When she finally called on the 3rd night, her voice was calm and steady. You've been quiet, she said. Work stuff. It's complicated, I managed, my hand tightening on the phone. The kind of complicated where people end up dead, she asked. I froze, realizing that for the first time I couldn't hide the monster behind the suit. I sat down on my couch, suddenly exhausted, and told her the truth. Yes, someone tried to start a war. I handled it, but it was close. Are you safe for now? She asked, her concern cutting through the darkness. Then come over. I'm making dinner, and you sound like you need to eat something that isn't takeout from a container. I shouldn't have gone. I had a dozen fires to put out and loose ends to tie up. But I found myself driving to her modest apartment in Queens, parking a car that cost more than the entire building. When she buzzed me up, the smell of jerk chicken and rice filled the small, immaculate space. I sat in her humble living room, surrounded by medical textbooks, feeling entirely out of place in my expensive suit, but finally feeling like a person again. I had been the chairman for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to be a man invited to dinner. But even as we ate, I couldn't ignore the shadow of Melanov. He was out for more than just revenge for a nephew. He was watching me, waiting to see if the Iron Chairman had finally developed a weakness he could exploit. As Yi Chuan drove back to Manhattan at dawn, the bubble of peace he had shared with Nya was shattered by the sharp vibration of his phone. It was Victor, and the grimness in his voice made Yi Chuan's stomach drop instantly. Boss, I did some digging into the girl just to make sure she was clean, Victor started, pausing for a beat that felt like an eternity. She isn't who she says she is. You need to pull over. Yi Chuan swerved onto a side street in Chelsea, his knuckles white against the steering wheel as Victor began to recite a history that didn't match the woman he had just left. Nya Monroe's real name was Tyra Carter. 3 years ago, she wasn't running from poverty in Atlanta. She was running from a murder charge. Victor's voice remained heavy as he detailed the police report. A man named Darius Webb was found dead in their shared apartment from a single gunshot wound to the chest. Nya had vanished that same night, changed her look, and started over in New York. Even more disturbing was that Darius Webb hadn't been a random victim. He was a low-level enforcer for the Disciples, one of Atlanta's biggest crews, and had been seen meeting with FBI agents just weeks before his death. You think she's an agent? Yi Chuan asked, his mind racing through every moment they had spent together, looking for a sign of deception. I think she's something, Victor replied. The warrant was dropped 6 months later because the family stopped cooperating, but she still lied to you about everything. As Victor sent the files, the crime scene photos and the images of a younger, harder Nya, Yi Chuan stared at the screen. Every memory of her was suddenly tainted with doubt. Just as he was spiraling, his phone buzzed again. It was Nya. Good morning, she said, her voice warm and unsuspecting. I couldn't stop thinking about last night. We need to talk. Not over the phone, Yi Chuan replied, his tone shifting to the cold, clinical authority of the chairman. Meet me at the warehouse on Delancey in 1 hour, Nya, or whatever your real name is. He hung up before she could respond, the weight of the underworld finally collapsing onto the one real thing he thought he had found. The warehouse was dead silent as Nya walked in, her hand instinctively moving toward her purse before Victor stepped forward to block her path. Yi Chuan didn't offer a greeting. He simply held out his phone, the screen displaying the cold, clinical details of the Atlanta police report. Tell me about Darius Webb, he demanded, his voice like grinding stone. The color drained from Nya's face, but she didn't flinch. She looked at Victor and the guards. Then back at the man who had looked at her with such vulnerability only hours before. Fine, you want the truth? Darius was my boyfriend, and yes, I killed him. Yi Chuan felt a sickening jolt, but Nya continued, her voice steadying as she revealed that Darius had been a federal informant who panicked when his own crew discovered his deal. He had planned to kill her to prove his loyalty back to the Disciples. I walked in on him loading a gun, she said, her hands trembling as she pulled up her shirt. Along her ribcage was a jagged, silver scar Yi Chuan had seen before but never questioned. He shot me first. I went down, but as he stood over me to finish it, I grabbed his ankle. The gun went off. The bullet went through his chest. She had fled to a clinic that didn't ask questions and vanished into New York, knowing that as a black girl who had killed a federal witness, no jury would believe her and no gang would let her live to testify. I did what I had to do to survive, she shouted, her defiance echoing through the hollow warehouse. Just like you've done. Don't act like you're an innocent victim here. You order people beaten and killed every day, but somehow my defending myself makes me the monster. Ye Chuan watched her, the moral high ground he had tried to claim crumbling beneath him. In her eyes, he didn't see a federal agent or a professional liar. He saw a mirror of himself, someone who had done terrible things to stay alive and had been paying for it ever since. The silence in the warehouse stretched between us like a living thing, heavy with the weight of her confession. I ordered Victor and the others out, needing the vast, hollow space to be as empty as I felt. As the door slammed shut, Nya stepped closer, her eyes searching mine for the rejection she had come to expect from the world. No more lies, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I need to know I can trust you, and you need to know exactly why I've been so twisted up. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and cold metal. It's my size, I'm too big. I watched her face, waiting for the familiar flash of disbelief or mockery. Every woman I've been with, once things progress, they panic. They say they'll get hurt. And they're not wrong. I've seen the pain I cause, so I stopped trying. Nya didn't flinch. She didn't look away or offer a hollow laugh. Instead, she crossed the distance between us and took my hands in hers, her grip grounding and warm. Ye Chuan, I'm going to be a nurse, she reminded me, her tone shifting into a clinical, steady calm. I've seen every body type imaginable. It's just biology. She squeezed my hands, forcing me to meet her gaze. I've been through worse than a physical challenge. If you think I'm going to run because of this, you don't know me at all. She leaned in, her forehead resting against mine in the dim light of the warehouse. We'll figure it out together, she vowed, like adults who communicate and don't panic. For the first time in my life, the physical curse I had carried felt like a problem to be solved rather than a sentence of isolation. We were two broken people, both running from pasts we couldn't change, but in that moment, the burden felt lighter. I realized she wasn't looking for a savior, and I wasn't looking for a victim. We were finally equals. The fragile peace we had built in the warehouse lasted only as long as the drive back to the city. My phone buzzed with a series of photographs that turned my blood to ice. There we were, Nya and I, leaving the warehouse, kissing outside her apartment, and having dinner at Lo Seraphine, all time-stamped and documented with clinical precision. Someone had been watching us for weeks, and they had sent everything to Melanov. A sick feeling settled in my stomach when Victor called Nya's number and it went straight to voicemail. 20 minutes later, the confirmation came. Her apartment was empty, her drawers were open, and she was gone. Then, the text arrived from an unknown number. We have your girlfriend. Come alone to Pier 34 or we start mailing her back to you in pieces. Melanov wasn't just after revenge for his nephew. He had reached all the way to Atlanta, discovering the truth about Nya's past and her sister, Kiana. He was using the one woman I loved as leverage to bring my entire organization to its knees. As I stood at the edge of the industrial dock at Pier 34, I saw her tied to a chair behind a rusted shipping container, duct tape over her mouth and blood running from a cut above her eye. Melanov's young enforcer stood over her with a gun held casually at his side, his eyes cold as he watched me approach. Walk toward me slowly, he commanded. I looked at Nya, and even through the blood and the tape, her eyes burned with a raw, unfiltered fury rather than fear. Melanov had found my only weakness, but he hadn't realized that by touching her, he had ensured I would burn the entire city down just to keep her safe. The warehouse air felt like poison as I watched the life I had built start to crumble under the weight of Melanov's demands. Victor stood beside me, his face a mask of grim calculation, but my mind was already blocks away, focused on the image of Nya tied to that chair at Pier 34. I knew exactly what Melanov wanted. He wanted to take out both the chairman and the girl, leaving my organization in a state of absolute chaos. It's a trap, Ye Chuan, Victor hissed, his hand resting on his weapon. He doesn't just want her. He wants to end you and seize everything. I looked at the burner phone in my hand, the screen glowing with a contact I had spent my entire career avoiding, Agent Leia Chin. For 3 years, the FBI had been hunting for Tyra Carter, and now she was sitting right next to the biggest target in New York organized crime. I realized then that the only way to save her wasn't through a gunfight, but through a total surrender. I hit the dial button. the silence in the room stretching until a cold, professional voice answered. "Agent Chin," I said, my voice steady despite the hammer of my heart against my ribs. "This is Chairman Kang. I believe we have something to discuss, but I have conditions." I laid it out clearly. I would give them everything, every ledger, every shipment, every bribed official in Melanov's network and my own. I would dismantle the Soul's syndicate piece by piece. In exchange, the warrant for Tyra Carter would vanish, her record would be wiped clean, and her sister, Kiana, would be placed under immediate federal protection in Atlanta. "You'd burn your entire world for a waitress?" Chin asked, her tone shifting from suspicion to genuine shock. "There is no world without her," I replied, staring at the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city I was about to abandon. "Not anymore." Victor's eyes went wide as he realized what I was doing. I was making a deal with the devil to save the only person who had ever seen me as a man instead of a monster. By the time I hung up, the wheels were in motion. The Iron Chairman was dead. The only thing left was a man willing to burn it all down for one chance at a real life. The antiseptic scent of the city's high-rises had long since faded, replaced by the smell of diesel and salt as the boat rocked gently against the pier. Victor stood at the helm, his expression grim as he steered us toward the designated meeting point where Agent Leia Chin and the federal authorities waited to take us into a new, uncertain life. I held Nya close, her hand trembling in mine, the weight of the chairman's crown finally cast aside in favor of a promise of quiet legitimacy. "We're almost there," I whispered against her hair, feeling the warmth of her breath against my neck. "Everything I built, I burned it for us." Nya looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the flickering lights of the Manhattan skyline as it retreated into the distance. "I don't care about the world you lost, Yi Hwan," she replied softly, her voice steady for the first time in days. "I just care that we're walking into the light together." But as the shoreline of the city became a blurred tapestry of gold and shadow, the fragile peace of the moment was shattered. None of us noticed the second boat trailing at a distance, its lights cut, and its hull slicing through the dark water like a predator. None of us saw the glint of the moonlight hitting a long-range scope as Melanov's final assassin took a steady, cold position. "Yi Hwan, look," Nya began, her eyes widening as she pointed toward a sudden movement in the dark. The sharp, clinical crack of a rifle tore through the night air before she could finish. The impact was a brutal, physical wall of force that sent us both crashing toward the deck. For a heartbeat, the world went silent, replaced by the searing heat of a bullet and the sudden, frantic shouting of Victor from the helm. As the screen of my vision flickered and the darkness began to take hold, a voice, Melanov's, seemed to echo through the cold wind of the river. "Did you really think I'd let you walk away?" The boat lurched, the city lights spun, and the last thing I felt was Nya's hand slipping from mine as the water took us both.